So today we're going to look at a couple of recent books by the Dalai Lama and how they impact on the question of secular Buddhism. Coming up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. And if you're new to the channel and interested in helping to try to promote a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled world, consider subscribing. So in a couple of the Dalai Lama's most recent books, one is called Beyond Religion. This is his most recent, or one of his most recent, and an earlier one, Ethics for the New Millennium, which was written back, I believe, in 1999. Both sort of outline the Dalai Lama's point of view on a couple of really interesting things. First of all, in the earlier book, the Dalai Lama is calling for what he terms a spiritual revolution of a kind, to help the world in the present day, where we have this issue with rising populations, with global warming, and with various kind of global issues that confront the entire world. But by spiritual revolution, the Dalai Lama does not mean a religious revolution. In fact, he means something quite different. What he says is that we need a universal ethics that in a sense is free from religious encumbrance. Now, before getting on to the Dalai Lama's positive claims here, I should say a word or two about the word spiritual when he calls for a spiritual revolution. Because I know that there are some within the secular or atheist community who have an issue with the term spiritual. They believe that it's been sort of too co-opted by religious terminology. But in fact, if you look at books like Sam Harris's recent book, Waking Up, he talks about the way that the word spiritual should not necessarily have any kind of religious connotations. And in fact, both Carl Sagan and Christopher Hitchens were perfectly happy to use the word spiritual in a secular context. People could be, if you like, spiritual secularists or secular spiritualists. Spiritual in the sense, which we'll get to in a minute, but basically having to do with an ethical kind of program. So at the beginning of his book on ethics, his recent book, Ethics for a New Millennium, the Dalai Lama says this. He says, "I've come to the conclusion that whether or not a person is a religious believer does not matter much. Far more important is that they be a good human being." So the notion of a spiritual revolution is not, in the Dalai Lama's understanding, does not revolve around their being religious at all. They could be religious or they could be completely non-religious. The point is to make people good human beings. And in fact, for the Dalai Lama, spiritual qualities are qualities that basically bring human happiness. So in his more recent book, the Dalai Lama says that there are basically two dimensions to spirituality. The first dimension is a sort of basic human need for spirituality in the sense of kindness, caring, compassion for one another. And the second dimension to spirituality is what he would term religious spirituality, which involves aspects of cultural upbringing from our parents, from our society, our culture, and often also involve metaphysical aspects of how the world is created, what kinds of gods there are, issues of supernatural aspects to reality. And the second dimension of spirituality is what the Dalai Lama basically brackets and leaves to one side, instead focusing on the first aspect, which has to do with the sort of basic human need for kindness and compassion, caring for one another. And there are two aspects to this basic spiritual well-being, or we might call it basic human values, or we might also call it secular ethics. There are two aspects to this kind of basic secular kind of spiritual ethics that the Dalai Lama views as very important. The first aspect of it he calls our shared humanity. That we are all the same in desiring happiness and in shrinking away from suffering. All of us want to be happy in some respect of what happiness is, and all of us want to avoid suffering in some respect of what suffering is. And of course, both of these are huge topics, and we might have debates on what qualifies as true happiness or what qualifies as true suffering. And of course, we all may say that people are willing to undergo suffering if they can foresee a better happiness in the future. So there are lots of aspects to this. But in its broad outlines, I think the Dalai Lama is quite correct. We have a basic human equality or identity in all of us striving for happiness and not wanting suffering. And the second aspect of this secular ethics or spiritual program that the Dalai Lama sees is our interdependence with one another. That is, that my happiness depends upon the happiness of others. If other people are caused suffering, that it will come back upon me in many ways. That all of us, our happiness depends upon each other. Equally, the suffering that is caused to some people tends to redound on the rest. Of course, also our interdependence comes in, let's say, issues of population growth, of overpopulation, issues, of course, of global warming, where aspects of human striving actually do have a negative global effect. And these basic human values are grounded in both reasons and emotions of unselfishness and concern for others. That is, they're grounded in both the reasons, the reasons that we can find to be not selfish, to understand in a conceptual, intellectual way that our happiness rises or falls together, but also, crucially, is an emotional feature of us, that these ethics are based upon emotions. And since they're grounded in these emotions, they don't rely essentially on teachings, religious teachings or religious dogma. They don't require grounding in any particular religion or any particular metaphysical picture of the world. They are a natural response to our shared humanity, a natural emotional response, as well as, of course, a natural rational response to our shared humanity. Once we see the humanity in others, we emotionally react in certain ways of caring, in ways of understanding that they are like us. And it's only by understanding this and promoting these kinds of emotions and indeed training to heighten these kinds of emotional responses that we can see this shared humanity more and more, and that we can therefore help the world to advance towards a shared kind of future where we are acting together. And this is overtly a secular kind of approach. The Dalai Lama says it as much in his most recent book, Beyond Religion, where he is basically saying overtly that this is an attempt to make a secular kind of ethics. Because if we're to work together, any dependence upon one particular religious ethics is never going to work, because it's always going to find pushbacks from those people who don't believe that religion, who happen to have opposing religious views. Therefore, the only way to create a kind of a global movement on behalf of ethical ends is to find some common core of ethical principles, such as those that I've just outlined and that the Dalai Lama goes to great lengths to outline in these books. Ethical principles that can be shared by people no matter their religious or non-religious background. And since these ethical principles are indeed part of the essence of Buddhism, they're part of the essence of both traditional and modern contemporary Buddhism, without, in fact, involving themselves in the particular metaphysical or ontological claims of traditional Buddhism, they fit exactly into a secular Buddhist approach. So this call for a spiritual revolution on the part of the Dalai Lama is important, not simply because of the content of what he's saying, which I think is very, very profound and wise, but also because of who's saying it. Because the secular approach to Buddhism is often caricatured as a kind of a Western conceit, as something that's anti-religious or anti-traditional. And since the Dalai Lama is, in fact, about as close as we can come to a Buddhist pope, without obviously having the power within Buddhism to be a pope, but nevertheless, he is the figurehead of traditional Buddhism as much as anybody is. And the fact that this is coming out of him, I think, is an indication of the power of a secular kind of approach within contemporary Buddhist belief and practice. So for any of you who are not familiar with these books by the Dalai Lama, I highly recommend them. The more recent one, the Beyond Religion, is shorter and a little bit easier to read. It's a little bit more sketchy, but also in its own way profound. The earlier one, The Ethics for the New Millennium, is, I think, a little bit more thorough in its approach. It covers more ground. And so you can see it as kind of a bedrock for the later book. In case you're interested in what the difference is between the two books, I recommend either or both of them. And for any of you who are interested in the issue of secular humanism and secular Buddhism, I'll put a link up here on the screen for an earlier video of mine on that topic. So let me know what you think about these kinds of ethical approaches, this kind of spiritual revolution that the Dalai Lama recommends for our future. I'd be interested to hear, and I'm sure everyone else would be as well. So put your comments and questions below. Thanks so much for your previous comments and questions. They're always great to read, always lots of fun, and I'm sure interesting for everybody else. So thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. Bye-bye.